Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending today. We are very excited to present our findings and recommendations to you all. I am Kelly. I'm a member of the Capstone Working Group, and I'll be kicking off the presentation today. This meeting will last about an hour till 2 o'clock. We'll have 30 minutes for presentation and about 30 minutes roughly for questions and comments. We do ask that you write down your questions and the corresponding slide numbers throughout the presentation so that we can address them at the end. We will begin this presentation with an introduction to Branford. We'll review the scope of the project, followed by our methodology for how we approach the project, our 10-step master plan recommendation, and finally, the complementary initiatives. In order to provide some background on the issue Branford is facing, let's review the big picture. Over the past decade, the community has been impacted by several extreme weather events, including hurricanes, tropical storms, and torrential rains. Climate change and sea level rise pose real threats to the community. Throughout many of these storms, the town has experienced flooding and damage to buildings, roadways, and other infrastructure. For those of you that are not aware, in an effort to execute its coastal resiliency strategies, Branford government officials have tasked our group, the Columbia University Sustainability Management Capstone Group team, to develop a climate change adaptation strategy and process for pursuing coastal retreat. In the United States, impacts from flooding, storm surges, and wind result in an average expected yearly displacement that exceeds 182,000 people. According to the First Street Foundation, 39% of properties within Branford are currently at risk of flooding, either inland or coastal. This all represents a clear problem that will be greatly exacerbated by the next natural disaster. The increased risk of flooding and displacement due to climate change is forcing governments all over the United States to present step-by-step plans for the long-term survival of their communities. These solutions fall into three primary categories: protection, accommodation, and retreat. Protection calls for the defense of vulnerable areas and requires extensive capital investment. Examples of this are protection measures that include seawalls, dune building, beach nourishment. Accommodations occurs when residents continue to use areas that are vulnerable to flooding and other climate risk. Examples of this include floodproofing, elevating homes, and creating flood storage areas. A retreat solution calls for the abandonment of land and structures in vulnerable areas and the resettlement of the previous inhabitants. Examples of this strategy include relocation of public facilities, roads, utility infrastructure. A long-term example of this strategy is managed retreat. Managed retreat is the purposeful and coordinated movement of people and infrastructure away from these risks. Branford is interested in pursuing a variety of resiliency measures, but at the request of the town, our report and our recommendations are informed by research conducted on best practices for sustainable and effective regulation of managed retreat. As a team, we were tasked with the following scope: conduct a benchmarking analysis of previous municipal attempts at managed retreat, create a deconstruction guide for properties that have been acquired, build a decision matrix for property acquisitions that evaluates the current, future risks, costs, and benefits, engage with stakeholders, and develop an effective retreat communication strategy with the town's residents. It is important to understand the scale of this strategy. The town has created a $1.9 million coastal resiliency fund to use for associated acquisitions and deconstruction purposes, with the hopes for additional funding from outside sources. However, we have been instructed by the town that acquisitions using this fund will not be considered for properties over $1 million. Given these two parameters, if Branford's resiliency fund is exclusively used for the voluntary buyout program, only a small number of homes, likely 2 to 5, will be acquired, and ideally, those properties will be grouped together in clusters rather than individually checkerboard properties. Alternatively, this fund could be used to meet the funding requirements of cost share for FEMA and or be used for open space development and long-term maintenance. The project was split into 3 subdivisions in order to effectively address the needs of our scope: community engagement, decision matrix, and deconstruction analysis. The subgroups collaborated to deliver a cohesive and comprehensive set of recommendations for the town. I will now turn it over to Isla, who will walk through our benchmarking analysis for Coastal Retreat.
Thanks, Kelly. So we started off the entire project by looking at Coastal Retreat case studies, and these were extremely important as these case studies were used to benchmark various flood mitigation efforts and informed many sections of our final report, including our decision matrix, potential funding options, policy recommendations, and our deconstruction guide. So we reviewed a total of 25 case studies to start in order to discover how different cities have been addressing flood risk. And some of the metrics we used to compare these case studies included their demographics, strategies for retreat, plans for acquired properties, whether or not they focused on residential deconstruction, and the success of that deconstruction. And ultimately, our team decided to concentrate on 6 of these 25 case studies because they had the most available information and the most complete deconstruction projects. So these 6 focused case studies are from Staten Island, New York, Valmeyer, Illinois, Isle de Jean Charles, Louisiana, Venice, California, and Charlotte and Topsail Island both from North Carolina. And each of these case studies has at least one vital piece of information that can be directly applied to Branford. So for example, as we see in the Staten Island case study, financial incentives are a huge plus and make voluntary buyout programs much more successful. Community involvement is a vital part of successful retreat strategies, as seen in Valmeyer. Residents should be presented with several viable options in the voluntary buyout program, as we saw in Isle de Jean Charles. There are shortcomings in infrastructure that should be addressed early on in order to reduce damage risks in the future, like they did in Venice. Acquired properties can be deconstructed into protective and absorbent grasslands, as seen in Charlotte. And finally, as we see in the Topsail Island case study, acquired properties can also be transformed for passive recreational purposes. So now I'll turn it over to Jason, who's going to walk you through engaging with multiple stakeholders to create an inclusive plan for this coastal retreat.
Thanks, Isla. Also critical to our methodology was identifying and engaging key stakeholders. We used qualitative and quantitative measures to answer several questions through focus groups, individual interviews, and an email survey. The core stakeholder groups included project champions and town leadership, the Planning and Zoning Commission, as well as the Conservation and Environmental Commission, the Coastal Vulnerability Working Group and RTM, and representatives from several homeowners associations. What we heard and read illustrated the diverse perspectives and priorities of residents with varying degrees of knowledge about coastal resiliency efforts. To us, it was very clear that there was a need to boost awareness of this work and to better solicit their views for consideration in the planning process. After conducting extensive research and pursuing our overall strategy, our team developed a 10-step guide for voluntary property buyouts. On screen is a visual of the guide itself, which we'll spend the next several minutes going through in great detail. But before we do, we feel it's our responsibility to underscore the importance of communication by the town for this strategy to actually work. That's true both before the guide starts to be implemented as well as during it. Now I'll turn it over to Mitch to start taking you through the 10-step guide.
Thank you, Jason. So the first step is really developing the master ideal acquisition map. And this requires assessing initial risk levels of Branford's properties. FEMA's flood insurance rate map gauges the base flooding risk for properties in the case of a 100-year flood. And it also delineates key flood zones. So most of the town falls under zones VE and AE with varying base flood elevations. According to FEMA, V zones are those areas closest to the shoreline and subject to wave action, high velocity flow, and erosion. A zones are also subject to flooding, but the flood conditions are slightly less severe than those in V zones. Areas labeled as zone AE and VE are both considered what FEMA calls special flood hazard areas. This FEMA map serves as the initial filter. If a property is within a special flood hazard area, it should naturally be assessed more closely. The team developed a risk scoring matrix to evaluate properties based on their current and future risks of flooding. Naturally, the quantitative analysis of Branford's properties requires a number of data sets, and many of those are just not accessible to the public. Therefore, drawing from the number of case studies and conversations that we've had with the client, the team has created a decision funnel that you see on the screen here. The town starts with a wide array of properties, and then using the FEMA map, risk scoring, and a benefit cost analyses, it progressively narrows down to a select shortlist of target properties. The binary matrix and Agile BCAs were built by our team to run on publicly accessible data, and therefore are used first to assess and compare the flood and storm risks. The more complex Base Point Matrix and FEMA's benefit cost analysis tool, which you see towards the bottom of the funnel, they require additional data that will be discussed later on in the process. Messing up. So the binary matrix comprises 4 sections. First, climate risks associated with the property, infrastructural vulnerability, economic risks, and possible mitigating factors that might actually reduce the overall risk of the property. For simplicity, each question in the binary matrix requires a simple yes or no response. The first question of the climate risk area is a multiplier question. So per FEMA's map that you all saw in the previous slide, if a property is located in a designated special flood zone hazard area, a multiplier will be applied to the total score. Now, it's worth noting that as we were developing this binary matrix, we recognized the future flooding risk may actually increase beyond what FEMA's current maps and available data are accounting for. So we encourage the town to seek locally scaled climate projections based on future risks, and then update the matrix as those new maps and data become available. Once a short list of high-risk properties has been made, a benefit cost analysis is executed to determine the potential efficacy of a property acquisition. We've built what we call the Agile BCA based on our case studies and FEMA's BCA methodology. So you can see here some of the benefits and costs that we're collecting. In terms of benefits, a couple of the big ones are the avoided cost of future protection, as well as the avoided physical damage that that property would experience in the case of a storm. The biggest costs, the largest is certainly the property acquisition fee, which is purchasing that property at fair market value, as well as the lost property tax revenue that the town will experience if the property is no longer a residence. So as a final task to this step, the properties are ranked by their binary scores, the benefit cost ratio, and the net present value that comes out of this benefit cost analysis. The properties are then plotted accordingly on what we're calling an ideal acquisition map, which should then be used in the following step.
So once Branford has this new map of potential acquisitions, the town will then need to focus on open space development. And we've outlined a decision-making process for the use of open spaces, and it takes into consideration FEMA guidelines, costs, and benefits. And generally, there are 3 types of open spaces that can be developed based on the buyout program that's going to be implemented. And these open spaces include patchwork, holdouts, and continuous. So patchworks have acquired lands that are dispersed sporadically among unacquired parcels. Holdouts are moderately connected spaces with minimal remaining unacquired parcels, and continuous spaces are connected and uninterrupted. And each of these open space opportunities have pros and cons that should be considered. And they're based on factors like the level of associated community engagement, their cost, the maintenance and management needed, ecological benefits, and community benefits. Something else to consider is that the town may want to contact a nonprofit organization or another third party to ensure that they're choosing the best method for open space for each property. And these organizations can provide the town with expertise specifically on open space development or provide other insight that the town may have otherwise overlooked. And one of these organizations is the Trust for Public Land. They can assist Branford in raising funds, protecting and restoring natural spaces, and collaborating with the community to plan and design natural spaces for public use. For example, the Trust for Public Land has a green printing service that helps communities first identify and understand open space benefits. And this process begins with engaging community members to understand their needs, and it ends with a computer-generated map that highlights key areas for protection based on the residents' conservation priorities.
So once the town has decided on a proper buyout scenario, it continues down the decision matrix funnel, then applies for funding, and ultimately approaches the homeowner for a voluntary acquisition. The Base Point matrix, as I mentioned earlier, allows for a more in-depth evaluation of the risk level of each property and should be used to develop a very short list of potential acquisitions. This equation is based on the City of Charlotte's flood risk assessment and risk reduction plan, along with some proprietary improvements by our team. The 4 components include a relative property impact score and 3 multipliers that you see on the right, based on the property's structural components, history of damages, and location. So you'll see that each hazard has a corresponding impact, which has a respective base point score. Each property has a certain probability of being exposed to that hazard. This probability is measured as the likelihood of a certain size storm occurring. So for example, a more severe Category 3 hurricane is a 1 in 500 year event, which results in a 0.2% chance of occurring in any given year, compared to a 1 in 10 year storm provides a 10% chance of flooding. To calculate the score of each impact on the property, the base points of that impact are multiplied by the probability of that impact occurring to the property. Those points are then tallied to get a total property impact score, which you'll see on the next slide. So the full matrix equation includes several components that I'll walk through now, and I showed earlier. We have the property impact score as discussed, and then we use the multipliers to more properly account for risk elements. So the first is the property multiplier. These are factors inherent to the nature of the property, which actually enhance its risk to structural damage. So for example, if the property has repetitive losses, its total risk score should be increased. The second multiplier is the location multiplier. These are factors related to the location of the property relative to its surroundings that either enhance its risk to damage from storms or are just a good grounds for increasing its reason for being acquired. So speaking to the latter, an example would be if the building is located in between a piece of critical infrastructure, such as a hospital, and the shoreline. If the answer is yes, then it should receive a positive multiplier. Lastly, and on the other hand, there are some factors that actually decrease the risk of a property, and we call these location mitigators. So these are factors related to the location that alleviate its risk to structural damage, such as seawalls or shoreline nourishments. All of these scores are used to compile a comprehensive risk score for the property, which is then combined with FEMA's BCA tool. So in order to receive hazard mitigation assistance funding from FEMA, Branford, and any municipality applicant is required to assess the cost effectiveness of each property using FEMA's benefit cost analysis tool. The resulting output of the BCA tool is a benefit cost ratio. The screenshot that you see on the screen is of FEMA's BCA Toolkit, which is a Microsoft Excel template and a plugin that can be downloaded directly from FEMA's website and used by any member of the administration. In order for the town to use the more complex and sophisticated Base Point Matrix and this FEMA BCA tool, it will have to acquire new data sets that range on topics like erosion, property elevation, the property structural and locational factors, and the current status of protection measures near these properties. And some of this information can be obtained from FEMA directly, and the agency also provides a free tool to estimate project costs. So we recommend ranking all of the shortlist high-risk properties by their base model score, the benefit cost ratio, and total MPV from FEMA to allow for the optimal comparison and decision-making process. Once these core values are attributed to each property, the town can then decide which properties to prioritize and prepare to reach out to residents for voluntary buyouts.
So throughout this 10-step process, it's most likely the case that financial assistance will be needed for voluntary buyouts and for open space development. And we found several funding programs that Branford can apply to from FEMA, HUD, Fish and Wildlife Services, DEEP, and the Open Space Institute. Some of these funding programs are specific to buyouts and others are specific to open space development. And depending on the conditions of the property and the timing of the acquisitions, certain funding programs will be more applicable and will be considered higher priority. And once the town has been approved for this funding, Branford can start approaching homeowners of these at-risk properties. All offers to these homeowners should include a timeline, financial details, and any specific requirements or instructions that they'll need to follow throughout the process. And during these conversations with the homeowners, we think it's critical to emphasize the voluntary nature of this process. We suggest being cautious about using the term managed retreat, especially early on. And lastly, we recommend focusing on creating this co-produced vision of the future. Once all these steps are completed, it's now time to move on to the deconstruction phase of the property and transform them into open space. And this deconstruction stage can be broken down into 4 main steps. The first is to inspect the acquired properties in order to determine the quality of materials and decide between deconstruction or demolition. This consultation will lead to cost estimates for services depending on the type of property that's been acquired. Second, they'll decide how to transform the acquired property. Then they'll follow through with either deconstruction or the demolition process. And lastly, they'll be able to donate and reuse these deconstructed materials or safely dispose of the demolition materials. And we've compiled contact lists for Branford specific to educational deconstruction training, deconstruction, and demolition services. Based on the community feedback that's received throughout this process, the deconstructed properties can then be converted into open space. And the aspect of incorporating this community engagement was further stressed after we received insights from our survey of the town. And through the survey, we learned that 73% of residents agreed that acquired properties should be used for nature and wildlife conservation. So the pictures on the screen right now show a few examples of this, of what acquired properties could be turned into, like salt marshes, parks, and green infrastructure. Additionally, the town may want to consider transferring the deed for acquired properties to a land trust or a nonprofit organization. If the town decides not to transfer ownership, Branford will be responsible for maintaining these open spaces. And there are many responsibilities involved with this, and they include long-term maintenance and management of the lands, monitoring to make sure there are no violations of deed restrictions, more funding, and volunteers or paid workers who need to carry out all of these duties. And this 10-step process should be evaluated and refined after each iteration to ensure that the process is effective for the town's needs. And this might include updating the base FEMA map to include future risks, such as 500-year flood zones or other relevant risks to the town.
In order to enhance the coastal retreat program's efficacy, we recommend that in tandem with the master plan, the town work on 2 additional areas: development of policy recommendations that enhance the retreat strategy and implementation of strategic community engagement toolkit that we have created. The town can further support resiliency efforts through the implementation of policy which can complement and strengthen a managed retreat strategy. Developing and implementing state legislation provides municipalities with the power to enact town-specific regulations which support the greater strategy. While there are a variety of legal, policy, and regulatory tools available, we put forward for consideration 5 recommendations: rolling easement, coastal setback, Beachfront Management Act, shoreline zoning policy, and reducing hard armoring. These policies are outlined in detail in our final report.
Also in the report is the very detailed engagement toolkit Kelly mentioned, but for the purposes of today's conversation, we'll keep things pretty high level. Frequent and clear communication with residents will help address concerns about sea level rise, storms, and flooding, as well as the risks Branford faces. It'll ensure they know more about the work already being done, and it'll allow them to impact decision-making on how community assets are managed post-buyout. One of the key takeaways from our conversations was that Branford had somewhat inconsistent, exclusive, and ineffective communication about its current approach to coastal resiliency. And we understand it's incredibly hard to get any message through to citizens right now. And that's the case in a normal era and especially in a pandemic. Many folks, many families are just trying to raise their kids, go to work, and keep their heads down. But in the conversations we had with stakeholders, it was pretty clear to us that there was an information gap. And if it's existing for them, and they should be the most plugged in people in town, the reality is that gap's probably larger with residents. And so to fix this, we've outlined 3 best practices from the case studies we reviewed. We found that first, retreat programs succeed when they're community-led and community-organized. That's part of why you've heard us say that getting residents more informed and involved will be useful. Second, that prominent community leaders must serve as champions of the plan, and that's backed up by our survey results, which show that the Board of Selectmen are the 2nd most relied upon source of info in town. And last, managed retreat is more successful when public property is addressed first. Our research found that Branford has several existing ways of communicating with residents and stakeholders, and that 4 of them should be prioritized. The first is meetings and workshops, and ideally some of those are conducted with homeowners associations and neighborhood groups. Our survey showed that 70% of stakeholders look to their homeowners associations for information, so partnering with them is smart. The town should also partner more closely with the Coastal Vulnerability Working Group. They're conducting presentations to individual neighborhoods to help build awareness of the risks the community faces. Joining their presentations once they restart this fall would be a good idea too. Second, we believe that the town should build a resiliency dashboard as a repository to aggregate information. This will give residents up-to-date info on what's being done and serve as a central location for direct inquiries and questions moving forward. It should also show how various work streams within the local government on this topic are connected. Third, in order to build trust and demonstrate that the town's approach is bottom-up and not top-down, it's key to build in regular updates, both formal and informal. This was something that stakeholder groups identified in our interviews as important for residents to become more informed. In addition, over 60% of people in the email survey, which had over 100 respondents, weren't familiar with the concept of voluntary property buyouts at all. And in addition, a meager 33% of respondents would support such a program, 22% would oppose it, and nearly half of folks say they're neutral. So this is a real opportunity to improve these numbers and build support, which will be helpful to avoid any major pushback if you do indeed proceed. And last, residents need to feel that there's ample opportunity for feedback and that their opinions are both solicited and heard. For that reason, ongoing survey work is needed to understand public opinion and ultimately be responsive to it moving forward. The results of our survey in its entirety are a good start, and they're listed in the appendix of the report, but the more transparent, open, and two-way the conversation can be in the future, the better, and opinion research will definitely help that. It doesn't have to be a massive, expensive effort, and we detail in the report some specific low-cost tactics for it and each of the other 3 items on screen. That puts us right at the 30-minute mark. So thanks, everyone.